Hi, Chris. Hi, Drew.
Hey guys.
Hi, Simone.
Hello.
What's up,
How are your spring breaks, everyone?
A lot of work, but I managed to do some fun things too, so it was good.
What'd you do that was fun?
Visited my friend for his birthday. I saw the Batman, and the Fresh Gallery show was pretty fun. And I finished my sleeve tattoo.
Hey, wow, man. Congratulations.
Yes. Thank you.
What'd you think of the Batman in like 12 seconds or less?
12 seconds or less. Okay, I would say it's about equal with the Christian Bale movie. So pretty good, honestly. Really good.
It was long.
Oh, did you not like it that much?
No, I have really mixed feelings about it. All I will say is about there's that one middle section where the Riddler is not part of the movie for a long time. And when he comes back on, my son looked at me and said, I forgot the Riddler was in this movie.
Yeah. There was too many enemies, I think. The penguin and some like guys.
You're right. I think you're right. But there a lot I liked about it, but it seems so similar to the Christian Bale movies that I don't know if we needed a new Batman quite yet, but I mean it was interesting.
I thought it was super badass. So I just like that they got rid of the goofy Ben Batman and went back to that. But that's just my
Yeah, no, I
opinion.
can see that. No,
Yeah.
I agree. I can see that. I'm gonna watch it again. How are you, Anisha?
I'm good. A little bit of a cold.
Oh no, I'm sorry. It's never any fun.
Yeah.
Is that your first cold since arriving in Boston?
Yeah, actually.
Sorry.
But it's fine. It's getting better.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's funny, since we're living in the COVID era now, colds were just something you got every fall and spring maybe, and now it doesn't even seem to rate on the scale of illnesses or things that afflict us now, right? So
But it's been a while since I've had a cold because of COVID, I guess. Because
yeah.
we've been in isolation. But yeah.
Are you okay to be here with us tonight?
Yeah, I'm good.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Chris, how was your spring break? Did you do anything? Or did you even have
It was cool. The only thing I was looking forward to was the reviews, to be honest with you. I had fun at the reviews. Had a good time. Really good time.
I hear it.
It was fun. A lot of work, because like for instance, just the projects themselves, but otherwise I'm good. I had fun. The mid-semester reviews were a lot of fun.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I was in the other room. I'm anxious to hear. I had a chance to see Drew, Anisha's, and Simone's, though.
Mhm.
You guys, I have to say, you absolutely all crushed it. It was fantastic presentations. I mean, honestly, way more than I expected at mid-semester. I mean, I cannot believe how much ground you each covered, how clear you all were about what you wanted to do, how thoughtful you were about what you've already done. Fantastic, really great. And Chris, I suspect yours was the same, if I know, based on our conversations the last couple months here. Did you get good feedback?
Yeah, I did. Very good feedback.
Great.
Very good feedback. Definitely.
Really happy to hear it. Hey, Andrew.
Hey, Joe. Sorry I'm a little late.
No worries, no worries. We were just chatting about spring break. Did you have a good one?
Sure. I had a spring.
Yeah, not much of a break though, right?
Yeah, that's okay.
Yeah. And how was your review? Were you happy with your feedback and everything?
It was neutral, so it's fine. Everybody liked my project. So that was cool.
Were you hoping for like better feedback or?
It's just more constructive, I guess. But
Yeah.
it's okay. Yeah.
Yeah. How about everybody else? Did you feel like you got good feedback? Either live or on Slack?
Definitely. The thing was, it was important for me to bring in a bunch of different ideas to each project. And what I liked, the feedback that I got was good in the fact of I wanted to bring like for instance, for my census project, I wanted to bring those into the thing, but I realized that I can't do that because we're not live. You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
just so the reviewers can get a feel of what I was where I was going with each project. You know, the senses, you know, so you can see this, you can smell this, you can look at this, touch this, blah, blah, blah. So I thought that, you know, I really wanted to kind of get into that and get people involved in terms of like, okay, this is the point of this project, but these are the steps that I took to make this project happen. And that's it.
Yeah, great. Good. All right. Okay, so I'm not sure if you remembered, but you had an assignment due tonight. Do you remember? It was the project 3. If you did not get it done, no worries. We can take more time to work on it. Now's a good time just to remind you that the whole idea of these assignments is to help you build your thesis proposal. There's nothing magic about the date of which this was due. So it's not really an issue, but it is something you're definitely going to want to include in your final proposal, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, Joe, I handed mine in, by the way.
Awesome. Okay, great. Great. I realized we hadn't talked about it in the last meeting, so maybe it fell off your radar. And I know you were all really busy with Fresh Media too, so it's really completely fine. Okay, so tonight was just kind of a mid-semester check-in for our class. I'll just say at the outset that I've been, again, thrilled with the progress that I'm seeing from each of you. It's really been a joy to see how you're building it. So, and how you're, doing your research and moving ahead. I think you're all in a really great place right now. But it's good to just check in and make sure that we're all aware of what each other is doing. So that's the purpose of tonight's conversation. So with that, Simone, you wanna kick things off tonight?
I was hoping for a few more minutes.
Oh, okay, no
I'm
problem.
sorry, I had to.
All right, you don't have to explain. It's fine. It's fine. Who'd like to go first? Maybe one of the gentlemen, or Anisha, would you like to go first? I don't care.
I can go.
Okay, lovely. Thank you.
Right. I gotta minimize things. That's yeah. All right. So I don't know if it's gonna be 20 minutes long, but like the motive is to tell you guys the progress and the plan of action ahead. So the work I've done so far, this is not like a progressive chart, but it does go in parallels. So the first sem, I kicked off the journey with like my UI UX work at its core with UI here now. And like I try to include UI and UX in every project that I do. Next, I garnered more skills in like working with sensors and the Arduino board. So I started thinking of projects in terms of curating experiences with these sensors. So that's what I worked with next. Then I moved on to like learning more about generative art and making visuals reactive to either audience interference or like even making sound reactive visuals. Then I went on to design interfaces for AR. And that's what got me to think about the future possibilities of how human-computer interactions can develop further. So that's what got me into human-computer interfaces and talking more about natural user interfaces. That's what then that's like a progression. I got into how gestures can be used to interact with interfaces in like your 3D space or like mid-air gestures to control interfaces around you in your environment. And the motto was to learn the tech behind it, to build stuff, to test it, to research, and to implement things and see how people react to it and what the inputs are. So the major takeaways from this was the things that I really enjoyed is what I got to learn out of the projects that I built and the things that I learned. So one of the main things that I really enjoyed was curating experiences and thinking of those experiences from a human point of view and having an empathetic lookout at the experiences that I create. I also realized I love designing interfaces as I've always, and also coming up with product solutions based on user testing and research. So every project that I would create, I would ask people around me to like kind of point out the flaws that they feel there are, and like I would try to make them better. Also to think speculatively about what the next level of interaction design could be and how it can solve problems in daily lives, um, especially how we communicate with the computer systems with the natural human interactions. So that's what got me into thinking about gestures as a mode of communicating with computer interfaces. Um, Also thinking about multimodal human computer interfaces, which is not just gestures, but also voice and expressions, etc. This has its application in the world of AR and VR, and that's where I'm trying to kind of implement all of these interactions. Also, I want to think about, is there something that we're missing when it comes to how humans interact with computers, or what the next thing could be. So those were my takeaways. But what I really want to concentrate going forward are the steps ahead and what I want to do. So I want to think about, do I want to explore more about gestures and also a multimodal interface, as I explained previously, like voice and expressions, etc., all coming together into communicating something with the computer. I want to keep learning about new tech, if there are better ways to refine these interactions, make them more accurate, and what the next big thing in the market is, what people are already using, and also to make it more accessible and inclusive in the way that not to use a lot of tech, but to make it cheaper and accessible to a bigger range of crowd. So machine learning, AI, and TensorFlow libraries, these were the few things that I discovered that could make it much more widespread. So I want to keep delving deeper into it. Think about the possibilities of this research in various industries and products in the market. Also, like, take feedback, test them, keep learning softwares, implementing ideas. And when it comes to implementing my ideas, all the research, I want to kind of implement it into experiences in audiovisual landscapes. So that's another field I want to keep researching. And the last step is not to just think about it from a very speculative and like a very positive point of view, but look at it from a critical point of view as well, and see why the tech has still not worked and what needs to be done and what can be done forward. So yeah, that's about it. Yeah. And the conversation that I would like to start here is, I would like to know from you people, what are the things that you look forward in a natural interface that could be of use to you in a daily life situation? So
Great questions and an excellent presentation. What do we think?
I think like contextual or proactive user interfaces are what I'm most excited for. Like if I'm doing something and it just comes up without me having to do anything, I think that would save me a lot of time. That'd be what I'm most excited for.
Something that just recognizes what you're thinking and it brings that up for you.
Yeah, or like what I'm doing, you know, like if you've ever gotten that notification on your phone that says like, oh, you bought a movie ticket, so turn on Do Not Disturb. Like I love stuff like that because it like knows what I want before I want it. I don't even think to do it sometimes, but it has it there for me.
Right. So what do you think AI and machine learning could be of use when it comes to that? Like recognizing your habits and seeing what you usually do in your environment and
Yeah,
implementing.
exactly. So like kind of being able to use machine learning to recognize what I'm doing now. That way it doesn't have to keep track of everything I've ever done.
Yeah.
I think that's like a limitation we have currently is that they need to store a lot of data, but in the future, I think they could probably be fast and smart enough to just do it right there for me,
Yeah.
kind of in line.
Yeah. Makes sense.
And imagine that in the medical device field,
Yeah.
right? I use a CPAP machine at night because I have sleep apnea. And the machine actually gathers a ton of information that it sends to a server. It's got a modem built into it. And it sends it to a server, and my doctor gets direct access to a deeper level of the information that I get. I get kind of the layperson's dumb information that tells me how many hours I slept, how many events. But what the machine doesn't do is when it notices things are bad, it can do certain adjustments on the fly, but it can't do really sophisticated adjustments on the fly. And so I think there's probably a lot of medical devices that could work similarly. And as Andrew says, you know, I happen to sort of take over a watch from my son, and that's recording all sorts of data. But there's nothing proactive about the watch right now or any of the apps. So I agree. I think that's really fascinating. And imagine that technology in your car or in your workplace. I mean, there's so many environments. It was nice to see you put on your slide somewhere what industries that would be most useful in. And I think, Anisha, that might be fun for you to think about is what the context would be, what the products would be, or the services. So, you know, like how could these tools be used in your kitchen, for example, right? That type of thing is sort of interesting.
Yeah. I think for now, I'm trying to kind of figure out the tech that's used behind recognizing all these motions and gestures, and then kind of thinking how to refine that, how to bring that into like a much more wider space of use. And also like the products are definitely something that holds application. I mean, that's the end goal of it. So yeah.
I just put, there's a wonderful course at MIT that many of our students have taken with Hiroshi. Do you know about this course?
Yes, yes. I actually thought of writing her an email, but I haven't yet. So
It's a him, just for the record. And he's lovely.
Sorry.
Really kind man. And you should talk to Tatiana, who took a class. And they did such a cool project. I'll let her tell you about the project. It was one of the coolest projects I've seen come out of that class with one of our DMI students. It was really interesting. I think you'd be especially interested in that one. But maybe ask Tatiana about her experiences there. It's really interesting because it's all about, you know, a tangible user interfaces. So very behind it, right? So what else? Other comments?
It's not like a super profound comment, but I wanted to say what draws me to things, whether it be like an app or a video game or a streaming service or whatever, is just like how engaging and dynamic the visuals for it are, like the visual aesthetics and the UI. Like I don't cook, but I'll have like a cookbook if it looks very awesome and it just looks cool and engaging, which I think that you consider that as a factor, but I just think it's worth saying. Like that will make me like overlook some aspects if the visuals are amazing.
Yeah. I compensate with visuals at times.
I know that's like a duh thing, but yeah.
No, but it's a really, really good point, Drew, and I think it's totally undervalued. You know, when you're creating these complex systems for people, they're going to spend time within it. It's like an environment for them. And if they don't like the way it feels visually or, you know, emotionally, they're not want to spending any time in it. So you have to really think about that.
Right. Visuals is again like it's a part of like designing that experience for the audience. So yeah, like I try to keep like experience design is something that I think needs to be a part of everything. Like that's what we are designing for. So
Have you spent any time looking at science fiction movies and Marvel movies and the way they express sort of cutting edge interfaces and things?
yeah, I do watch all the Marvel movies, but as soon as I'm done watching them, I don't remember anything.
Yeah,
So
neither do I. Did you see
but yeah,
did you see
there's a
the
lot
Tom
of
Cruise movie?
speculative.
Yeah, exactly. Did you see Minority Report?
Yeah, that's what comes up in every article that I
Yeah, I
read.
know.
There's like a reference to Minority Report.
Well, I think part of the reason is it's based on real, you know, very modest technologies that are trying to do the same thing. So, but I think also what you see is too, what does the particular application need? What do you need to do to sift through that many images, for example, or
Right.
what do you need to sift through a video very quickly? So much of that is, you know, orientated.
Yeah.
So yeah.
That's what like when I was working with this, when I worked with like TensorFlow and like a simple JavaScript that could be embedded in your web application or like any application for that matter of fact, that makes it so much more accessible. Like it could be in every laptop that you want it to be. So it's not like you need like really high tech devices to run these things. So like for now, I think I'm thinking from point of view of how it can solve like problems, not being too speculative about it, where like I'm like right into the metaverse right now because metaverse is still like 10 years to come.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm trying to kind of think of it from a much more ergonomic point of view, if that makes sense. I don't know.
Makes sense to me.
Yeah, I was going to ask that question, Anisha, that would you want to use this technology for problem solving more compared to just say what Andrew was talking about earlier about that the technology knows what you're thinking before you have that thought, or the technology knows what you want to do before you do that specific thing. Do you want to gear what you're doing more towards problem solving or more towards the experimentation of that experience of AR and that type of thing? Is that your end goal in terms of problem solving compared to knowing what people think and what they do before they do it?
Right. So the case that Andrew provided is that he wants to know, like he wants to see things when he's thinking of things. So I think that's a case of problem solving where I need to solve that problem for him. So yeah, the things that I'm chasing are like these real life situations that can be solved with multimodal user interfaces. Like, can multimodal user interfaces be beneficial when it comes to everyday lives? So that's what I'm trying to change.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Right, that makes sense. Thank you.
What's the most complicated object you have in your house or that you use every day? Yeah, it's not a computer.
Oh, Anything in the kitchen. I
Yeah.
can't really. Yeah.
Well, I think those are interesting places to start. You know, I find the car is a very complicated
Yes. Yes.
object,
Yeah.
and it's become essentially more and more computers on wheels. Like you just look at a Tesla, it's a computer on wheels. So, but it is interesting to think about because you do require a certain, affordances, for lack of a better word, and interfaces to use it. And it's not always a screen that you touch or a voice that you speak to. So, like, I think, look in the kitchen and see what works.
Like a washing machine.
Yeah, washing machine's a great example.
Washing machine in terms of like, for
Great
instance,
example.
someone who has this specific article of clothing says it can't be washed in hot, but it can be washed in warm. So you're giving yourself those two leeways into washing a load of clothes, but specifically a certain kind of load of clothes.
Right.
That's a great
But-
example.
Yeah. But it's interesting that you mentioned like a driving situation, because I read this thing where it said like you don't want the user to focus on the tools, rather you want them to focus on the task. So I think that's where the thing that I'm trying to work towards, that's like a natural user interface. That's where that comes in, where like I want it to be as natural of a communication between human and computer as much as it is between human and human. So yeah,
Yeah.
like
Yeah, I hear you, but then try to explain why there are giant displays in cars now, and some of them have them across the entire dashboard, Anisha. It's
right.
some of the Mercedes are just like, it's crazy. Like that is not good for your driving. I'm sorry, it's just not. So, but I hear what you're saying, and I think those are some of the problems you have to work with.
Yes, definitely. Yeah.
Great.
I think cars are a huge possibility.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Lots of work to be done there for sure. Okay, any other comments for Anisha?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I encourage you to keep in mind too when you're designing interfaces is that obviously when you design, you want to have an ideal human, but one of the bigger problems that we're facing with interfaces that are touch but not super dimensional in their actual physical space is that they're not as accessible. Like there are definitely adjustments that you want to be mindful of in your professional life, or like to talk about maybe regarding accessibility, regarding tactile accessibility specifically, that don't get talked about enough, I feel like. And it's it'd be great if you could keep those in mind.
Definitely.
That's something I look for, especially like I'm not I'm not disabled truly, but I look for a lot of high contrast because I can't read things very well. Yeah, so, and sensitive like volume controls because I can't hear things very well, or I get really easily overwhelmed by sound. So things like that you want to keep in mind for sure.
Definitely. I think going forward, that's one thing I want to keep in mind is being critical of the technology. Like, why is it still not working? What needs to be done? So yeah, I think that's a great point. Yeah.
It's a really healthy place to start with any redesign project, right?
Yeah.
Great. All right. Any other comments for Anisha? I liked the format of your presentation tonight. It's nice to see kind of where you've been and where you think you're going. And then to be able to ask yourself those questions at this point in the process. It's really wise. It's like you've taken a step back and looked at it all over and thought about it. It's great. It's good strategy. All right. Thank you, Anisha. Who would like to go next?
I'll go.
Thanks.
Let's see.
Thanks, Drew.
Share everything. Okay. I know that I talked about a lot of the stuff I'm working on yesterday for 3 of you, so I tried to like add some new stuff. But these are the 2. Oh, there's like 4 little topics / questions here that are really like 2 questions, but this is what I've been like into this semester. Race in video games in terms of user accessibility and relatability, and race in video games in terms of research and education. So essentially just on the topic of race in video games. And then also on the other spectrum, on the other side of the spectrum, what it means to be a human in terms of humanity and physicality, and why are we here and where did we come from? And basically the 2 questions are like dealing with the accessibility that minorities and underrepresented races have in modern video games. And also I have this interest in, you know, a lot of quantum physics and simulation theory. And I've just been exploring ways of kind of using magical realism and like sci-fi themes to represent these issues of race in a way that is more digestible through the sci-fi themes. And you know, that'll probably make sense. I know a lot of the stuff that I'm talking about might not make a whole lot of sense right away, but I'm sure that it will as I talk about it more. This question kind of doesn't really have a whole lot of context right now, but I've been thinking of ways to like link the research together, and just something that I'm keeping in mind is if the humanity of mankind was suddenly tested by higher beings, would we pass the test? And that is essentially coming from a place of like, if we consider ourselves as, if you look at like where we came from as people, what we're essentially made of, I'm sorry, when I get out of Yvette's class, my mind is just like all over the place. So I'm just gonna come back to that if it comes to me, but exploring these concepts through sci-fi. The benefit of this is it gets users out of their earthly state of minds, and that just means, because I think that a lot of the things I'm talking about are earthly issues, like institutional racism and the underrepresentation of minorities. These are earthly problems, but I think if you wrap up those problems through a different lens, like what I mentioned before, like using magical realism to present these problems in a different way, it kind of makes it easier for people, instead of just like having the same conversations over and over again. Instead of just telling people about these problems, they'll get to really see it. That's kind of my whole goal with all of this. Show them these issues through this sci-fi lens. And then oh yeah, I talked about that. Yeah. I started going down this path, as a lot of you know, for my project, the 11th Hour and the Fresh Media Show, which basically sends the user to a journey through space where his ship is malfunctioning and he doesn't have long to live. And the idea with this project is to have a lot of the content for this project be produced by the user, just put them in a space where they can reflect upon their own thoughts. And now I'm kind of switching gears and trying to prompt like these thoughtful issues for the user to think about. And this project, it's called Human Data, which is a game, but more so it is a presentation of data and research where the user collects data chips throughout the course of the game, which unlocks relevant information and research that eventually pushes the narrative forward and just helps and brings light to the issues that I spoke of before. So basically, all like simulation theory, that's like that's the forefront, but it's actually like the layer that's on top of all the racial issues that are kind of not so obvious, but I want that to be like the real kind of substance and message behind the game. Which is another big point of the game, is it's a story on institutional racism. And how that works is, I'm thinking before and after each level, there's motion comics, which I'm working on, and we'll probably talk about that later, not today, but where it's the story of a Black man who just throughout his life goes through instances of racism, whether it's like small instances or big instances, and that is, he is kind of like the avatar for one, Black people to be able to see this and relate to it, and just other races of people being able to acknowledge and recognize things that go on in a way that's showing them and not telling them. And starting with the foundation and building substance. Yeah, so far this semester I've just been working a lot on the technicalities of making games. There's a lot of like coding, a lot of new learning to do. So I haven't really gotten to everything that I've been talking about so far, like implementing the story and the research and the sci-fi elements. It's kind of just been like, okay, make this avatar. He can run left, he can run right, he can attack enemies, making the backgrounds, environments, and all that. So of course, now that I've done a lot of that, I can really get into the substance of it, but there's still like a little bit more. It's kind of like a little buggy. And as far as who the game is meant for, like I said, it's gonna cover kind of deep topics. So I think that the benefit of putting it in this game format does make it possible so that it engages with a wider audience, but at the same time, I don't want to filter anything. Some of you heard me talk about this before. That's just going to make it less interesting to me. So I want to make sure that it's the most, I think you guys know what I'm trying to say. So using one character as an avatar for several relatable occurrences from our news. I've already talked about that. And the message of institutional racism under the sci-fi layer that ultimately pushes the story forward. Yeah. So yeah, the whole thing takes place in space, and the first story is just kind of like setting up the plot, the first like comic that gets the games going, and I just want to like get the user playing the game. And then throughout each level after that, it's like flashbacks to this character's life and the experiences of racism that he's had, which ultimately bring him to the point where he is at, where the user's playing him. And I want this game to be like completely original. This character is kind of inspired by Mega Man and Among Us, kind of like merged together, Among Us characters. But I just wanted to make this game like almost by myself, so it's obvious that everything is coming from the same place, even the environments and most of the assets. So it's gonna be quite the project, because most when people try to make a game of this scale, it is made by teams of people, but I'm going to try to plan everything out so that it's possible to do by one person, so I could eventually publish it as a game on a gaming platform such as Steam. Not a whole lot to say on this slide. Joe recommended this book on the far left to me, The Anomaly, that I read over spring break. And that was kind of a good inspiration, not only because it had like a lot of conversation about simulation theory and like mentioned my favorite philosopher, Nick Bostrom, which I like lost my shit when he was quoted in the book because it was so cool. But also just like there's a lot of characters, like for instance, one of the passengers in the plane is like a Black woman, and kind of like goes over her story of like being a woman in the workforce and how she interacts with the older white men, and how there's this dynamic in this game that she has to play to succeed, to just afford the medical expenses, I think, for her sister and stuff, and that how she has to act and how she sees through like all the fakeness. And there's like really like kind of relatable experience that she goes through that I'm sure a lot of Black people also go through. And I'm sure that, I mean, I'm not white, so I don't know how if I would like be as cognitive of these experiences as well. But I think that is something that would actually add to the project that I'm working on now. Just like the way, just being able to like verbalize those kind of experiences, because that's not something that I really have verbalized often. And then I like couldn't get enough of it, so I like got these 2 extra sci-fi books, which are also based on similar stuff. So haven't read those yet, but will. And these are the questions I had today, because I know a lot of this doesn't make sense, so it's like hard to give feedback on it. So it's kind of more like you just have to see it as it goes. But I did want to know, like, when the user collects data along their journey, it's mostly like research on simulation theory, and the aspects of race in the game are kind of the underlayer of the game that are like scattered across the motion comics and stuff. But do you think I should also add that as like when he picks up a data chip, there's like pieces of information on African American history? Or yeah, and then I also was wondering, are there any particular research, like historical events, people that have had great impacts throughout history, or studies that you think would be beneficial or additive to this project that I could include, that you think would add a lot to the message that hopefully is pretty clear at this point? And what draws you to a game, or any design or gameplay elements that you enjoy? Like if you have any favorite video games or 2D platformers that you thought were really fun, what kind of elements made that game that fun for you? I'll close out, but I guess I'll leave the questions up for just like a minute or so.
Hey, Drew, I think what you should think about is think about the people, Black designers who have created video games, but also Black engineers who, for instance, the women who Hidden Gems, Hidden Figures, the women who did the Apollo space missions back in the 50s.
Oh.
It was 2 African-American scientists, and one just passed away, as a matter of fact. But maybe include that in there in terms of saying what they had to deal with in the 50s during segregation, and they were scientists. And also think about maybe including them or other scientists or engineers of space-related issues or video games, and include them in there and talk about what they had to deal with to break into the video game industry, or into space, into NASA, where there weren't a lot of Black engineers or scientists, and we wouldn't know about Hidden Gems or Hidden Figures if we didn't read about it. So maybe you might want to consider talking about their lived experiences, but also, how can I, as an African-American male, relate to that in terms of breaking into the field of, for instance, video game design, because that's your focus. So maybe you might want to consider thinking about using those different aspects in the video game to talk about how this experience affected them, but also how it affects me, the user, or someone else who's also a user, and also maybe throwing something dealing with empathy for people that are non-Black. You know what I mean? Could you relate to this issue that I'm dealing with in terms of why the field of video game design has not included people of color, but at the same time, how I can use that to get across your point about not only institutional racism, but also how it makes that person feel, how it makes someone who's, for instance, the Hidden Figures ladies, when they were doing all the work for NASA, they weren't getting the credit. They never got the credit until now. So how did that make them feel, being, these women were scientists, they were engineers, and so on. But I'm talking about going back even further than that, but also going into the 60s as well, and including that in your project in terms of how did that make them feel, and how does it make you feel as the designer,
I agree with that.
That makes sense.
That was very good.
Using those as examples of the whole idea of institutional racism, but even in the field of design and in the field of engineering, it's across the board, and how does it make the user feel on an emotional aspect,
I want the user to I want the main character of this game, which ultimately was going to represent the user, but I decided to like make him his own character. I want his reactions to like reflect what I think the user might be feeling at that time, which I know a lot of like storytellers do. I want him to be like the representation of the user. And I also, there's only two characters in this game. It's very simple. There's like the main character, and I want there to be like a white scientist that like is like in his ear. So I wanted to give like two different perspectives to it, so that two.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. And that's what I meant about the whole idea of empathy. Seeing if the person, the white friend, feels what he, you know. In other words, walk a mile in my shoes. In other words,
yeah,
that's what he's saying to his friend. You know what I mean? How would you feel if you were going through this if you were me?
Yeah. Yeah.
Good question for you, Drew. How aware or subconscious, that being the spectrum, do you want the player to be about the fact that this story is about racism and systemic discrimination and all of that stuff while they're playing? Like, how much of this do you want it to be like, I want to engage them and make them feel really immersed in the thing and know that this what this is about? Or are you going for something that's a little bit more they don't really, like, they can see that the character is Black and that the friend is white, like, for example, you know, they're aware of those details, but they're not really like formatting the information, the facts, in a way that kind of allows the fact that this is about the Black struggle to be obfuscated until the very end and have like a debrief moment where it's like an epiphany moment. Like, what structure of sort of unraveling of narrative are you going for with that?
I think that is a great question. I think to some degree that will vary on the user, but I also think there's like some power behind it not being incredibly clear, and just as the user sees all these things happening to this person, and then they come to the conclusion themselves that, wait, this is because of these things don't happen to me, or these things happen to me, and then they come to the conclusion themselves it's his race and that he's Black.
Yeah.
I suspect that many people will catch on to that very quickly, but I also think that that's powerful as well.
Were you, yeah, like I guess I would suggest you having a sort of like potentially pedantic ending thing where you're like, the two timelines differ, or even having like the player, because you mentioned two characters, right? Having the player have to switch characters midway through to contrast the experiences and have them be sort of parallel, and then talk about the topic at the end. Because I agree with you, there's something very powerful about not realizing exactly what it's about in the real world and feeling it very personally in the game, and then making that connection at the end. And I encourage you to see Andrew's comment that he just put in about a different piece of media where the gender of somebody was obfuscated until the very end of, yeah. So yeah, I really encourage you to do that. As far as the historical stuff, if that's the route you go, of what we just talked about, if that's the route you go, I would also encourage you to, I definitely think you should, first off, include historical stuff that really did happen and find a way of revealing those details about this thing is about race, like this thing really happened at the very end, to really bring in that impact. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah. Yes, that is how the plan is. Like, when he collects a data chip and level, the reward is that like the other character like gives him a piece of information. I was wondering if like I should make that like historically based, and I'm thinking I will. But yeah, thank you.
Well, that's one place you could put that information, Drew. Like, there may be multiple areas throughout the game or time periods throughout the game where your player gathers more information, and that could just be one of them. I think it's a great idea. But you could also have him watching newsreels or watching, listening to radio or podcasts and delivering information that way, for example. But I love that idea. I think you're getting great feedback. I really I just want to echo Simone's. I think that's something as a gamer that you're really going to understand well, is how to adjust that narrative structure to the gameplay so it's still engaging. I can't speak to it, but I can see it from a narrative point of view that it's going to be an interesting problem for you to wrestle with,
I think
One question. Sorry, go ahead.
no, I just want to say I thought that was really good. Like I didn't think about like other ways of relaying the information. Like I could look up like historical statues or things like with the Apollo space missions that Chris was talking about, like what kind of like objects represented that, and I could put that in the game where they could just like, yeah.
It could be a celebration of the 900th year anniversary. I don't know what year this is set in, but of the man landing on the moon, and she could be watching, or he could be watching film clips. That's a way to deliver it. Just think about all the different channels at which you could deliver it. They could get lost in a research library, and there could be books there that they pick up. Lots of really interesting ways, and maybe you're offering many different ones so that the player gets a choice of how to get that information. I don't know how far to go with this. You're going to have to decide for yourself, but that's part of the beauty of that three-dimensional game environment that you can create, is that people can wander around a little bit. And I think when they discover it for themselves, my sense is it's going to be more meaningful than being told it. And that's kind of what you're saying. It's like, we can sit down and have a conversation about all this stuff. It's going to be difficult. But if you're creating these opportunities for people to learn about it and develop their own levels of empathy, as Chris is talking about too, I don't know, it sounds pretty powerful experience to me.
That's 100% it. And yeah, I am planning on making like really big levels where they could go and find the information themselves.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna think about more exciting ways to like present that information. Yeah.
Are you thinking that this game is going to be your major thesis project that you're going to do for the whole time you're here? Because it sounds like an incredible amount of work.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, which is great, by the way. It's no problem. I think one of the nice things about DMI is that you have flexibility to go do multiple smaller projects, one or two big projects. I think it's really exciting to do this. It's really exciting.
Yeah.
If I may make one more suggestion, I was just thinking about the complexity of the situation already, and how in real life, if you make just end that thought, if you make your character decidedly male, you might run into issues of intersectionality that don't give the whole picture. So you could take a route where you give your character very gender neutral appearance, name, pronouns, etc. And that opens up the experiences that both, that people who are Black on the entire range of gender have to put into that game, instead of, trying to limit it to experiences that only a Black man could have. And also that gives you an opportunity to do sort of field research and get a lot of, information, because obviously you're not a Black woman, so you can't, or a Black non-binary person, or Black trans person, so you can't speak to those experiences, but there are plenty of ways that you can engage with the community at Mass Art even, and represent other people by having this very gender neutral character. You don't have to. It's just a thought, an opportunity to really, especially if you're going to use the whole year to do this, that you can do that as well. Really great idea. I love it so much.
I think that is a big consideration. I do know that my one little small like pushback is sometimes when you try to like include everyone, which I'm not like against that, it's sometimes like detracts. Like the Spider-Man movie Into the Spider-Verse, they made Miles Black and Hispanic. Actually, what am I saying here? I don't know. Like it's kind of like I know a lot of people in the Black community, they feel like they just want a Black superhero. They don't want a gender neutral. They want someone who really is like them. So I feel like this game will be beneficial to anyone, whether you're from the Middle East, white, Australia. I'll consider that though. That's just gonna have to be
Yeah, I'm
something I
not,
think
you don't
about.
have to take it, but it's something to think about
Yeah.
because, and I can't think of the correct research to reference you directly, but when you talk about intersectionality in race and gender and sexuality, sort of like the whole spectrum and how that intersects, there's, and there's not consistency with this, but the ones that I've read, there is a clear and pretty significant gap in the difference between treatment of Black men and Black women and then trans Black women. It's
wait.
not like they're like,
Wait a
what?
minute. No, I just I'm not feeling that, Simone, because I guess I feel like I understand your point, but at the same time, for instance, the guy who started the March on Washington, he was a Black gay man. I forgot his name, but he's the one who put together the March on Washington. And the thing was, when he put that together as an example of that, they didn't want to put it out there that it was a gay man that did the March on Washington, that set up the whole thing. So they had as much, negativity towards a person who's gay as anyone. But I guess in this case, it's more like, there's nothing wrong with spreading that around, but at the same time, James Baldwin was gay, Langston Hughes was gay. And that's something that a lot of people don't know. But that's something that we respect because that's that art that was created through these gentlemen. And at the same time, with this specific thing, Drew could include a gay character in this game as well. He could include a gay character like a woman, for instance. That might not be a bad idea in terms of a third character.
I guess, so I do think that you think we're disagreeing potentially, and I don't think we are, but that's okay. I just don't want to add more work for Drew. Like, I'm just like, okay, 2 characters is already a lot of work. Like, how can we include more experiences? That's literally all I'm saying. I don't think we disagree because I totally agree with you. Like, there is a lot of complexity and intersectionality and what information gets put out for convenience and acceptability and absorption. I totally agree with that. And Drew, you can take the information or leave the information, but there is this significant gap. Like, yes, you can say just race. There's like, there's like this distribution, Black or theoretically, like at the bottom, not theoretically, excuse me, statistically at the bottom, right? And then within that, if you separate by gender and then you separate by sexuality, the gaps get bigger based on where on those intersections you fall. That's all I'm saying. And so it's possible that you have enough material to just do the experiences of Black man. But if you're like, oh, I want even more complexity to it.
But I like the idea, Simone, of the Black female character who's gay, because of not only because of what she as a woman deals with when it comes to feminism, but how feminism, for instance, never included women of color. And I say that because that's something that he could include, would be a gay character who happens to be female. I think that's a good idea, personally speaking, because we want to get that other experience of a female who happens to be Black, but also happens to be queer, but also is shut out from the larger feminist society. And I think that would be a good idea for you to go into if you decided to add a third character, would be to look at the intersectionalities between being gay, being Black, and being female, and how it's never really been a part of the whole feminist ideology. And that's what I'm trying to say, Simone.
Yeah.
I think he should, you know what I'm saying, Drew, in terms of having a third character, have a female character who happens to be gay. And so you can talk about those issues about Black women, being Black and being gay, but also the larger, how Black women don't fit into the larger role of the feminist movement.
it'll be really easy to talk about those kind of people. I don't know if I'll do it like through a character, but whether it's just through the way I present information, they'll definitely be represented 100%.
I think the way I look at it is to get the point of institutional racism across. So I think probably get that point across, and we could like do away with like gender specific experiences.
Yeah.
But like, yeah, I think
That's exactly it.
Racism is what needs to come across, is what I'm taking away from what Drew's trying to say.
Yeah, and I'm just gonna end it, but because that's how the whole story starts, is like he's falsely accused for a crime, which is like, I'm pretty sure statistically a huge thing in Black men, and that's how he gets sent into space, and that's just like a big plot thing that I've kind of like made the whole narrative off of. So, but I will 100% represent Black women and find a way to represent Black gay people as well. And thank you, Andrew, for all your comments. I'll read them. I'm just not good at like multitasking.
No, that's what they're there for. You can look at them later, ignore them, look into them, do whatever you want.
No, it's good stuff, especially the Sun Ra.
Sun Ra is the best.
I love Sun Ra.
So good.
Yeah. So Drew, great, really exciting work. It's fun to hear you talk about it. I can tell you know what you want to do, and the way you're expressing it each week is clearer and clearer for us. So really well done. It's exciting.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Simone, would you like to go?
Yes, I'm ready. Thank you.
Awesome.
Okay. Okay, so ladies and gents, buckle up your seatbelts because this is going to be a ride. And Joe, I'm in a very different place than I was at 11:30 this morning.
Okay.
So, yeah, so I'm just gonna give this update as quickly and concisely as I can because there's a lot of stuff to cover. So I did talk briefly in my review about where I started in January, which was with this new definition of manufacturing, a bunch of time periods that I wanted to cover. And I did a quick calculation, which you all have already seen this picture on my conclusion about how many projects theoretically could fit in my 3 years, 2.5 years left of DMI. And that led me to think about, what is feasible and what is accessible. And I know those are much more than what you talked about, Joe. So I'm going to get to that. But I did decide to narrow down my focus to 2 time periods from that original presentation, what I've called the digital era, which starts with the creation of the computer through to 2010. And then what I'm calling the post-digital era, which includes a speculative, which is 2010 to present to future. Mostly because this is DMI, and I was like, let me just do a focus on digital and post-digital technology. It felt good and it was narrow, or still 70 years. But yes, so in the last 2 weeks, I have made some crazy amount of conceptual progress. And honestly, I didn't really have spring break to work on this. So I've only really done this in Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. So here are some conceptual conclusions that I didn't get to go into too much in reviews. I asked myself these immense amount of questions about manufacturing and its relationship to other realities in humanity to kind of be able to put my finger on what manufacturing really was, because I already had this definition and it's pretty and I do feel like it's accurate, but like it felt like something was missing. And I have some mind maps to show about some of these. And then I use that information and the information about how many projects I have left and the mind map that I showed you all to try and decide how I wanted to put out my project. So I've come up with sort of 7 project ideas and that involve a variety of manufacturing techniques, materials, concepts, to address the complicated existence of manufacturing in society. So one of them is a project with a CNC router that explores usage of waste. And it explores the concept of, which already kind of exists, but it doesn't actually use waste, the concept of 3D printing with wood waste, with sawdust, with wood particles, different colors, and so on. And it also explores the concept of combining physical projects with something more digital. So having, finding a way of digitizing the medium, which is much easier with metal. But I'm kind of passionate about figuring out how the frick to do it with wood. I don't really know. Other than like actually embedding digital things into the wood. So a thing that I'm exploring. And then also had to go back and define dynamic media for myself. I know we talked about doing that in studio, but I actually did it. And I did it in the way that I do everything, which is by defining words and understanding those concepts that they refer to. And I'll show that a little bit more, but really focusing on the media portion of making physical objects. Physical objects in and of themselves can be quite dynamic, but how can I make physical objects media? And I'll talk a bit more about that. And then answering the question that was first posed by Drew, and I've gotten about 15,000 times after this, are digital products manufacturing. And I'm excited to give you a fledgling of an answer. And then the scope of waste and the future of 3D printing, because the idea of reducing and making increased efficiency of using multiple machines for one project versus using one machine for that project and how that impacts the world. And then talking about manufacturing relative to other words that are associated with it. And then talking about the chemistry of plastic and using up the waste that we consider unuseful and it's just taking up space. So I just wanted to include the stuff that I'm reading that I haven't done a ton of reading on, but that I'm in right now, trying to answer some of the questions I posed earlier. And these are some mind maps that I want to go into detail, which I didn't get the chance to do in reviews. This was dynamic media. And what I did was use all the possible definitions available on the internet of each word and highlight the words that I felt like had a lot of, that came up a lot, like that are sort of getting to the essence of what that word means, that word's fingerprint. And those are respectively in blue and green. And so what I did notice was that with dynamic, there's a lot of emphasis on movement and change and growth and progress and energy. So I took that concept and the fact that it's an adjective. So like the idea that whatever you make has to be dynamic in sort of the adjective space of its reality. And then the word media, which focuses on volume of shared information through communication. And like how it's related to the word medium, and taking those two concepts and coming up with this sort of baby definition for me, for what I'm doing, of dynamic media being a force of continuous change, evolution, communication, progress, transfer of energy and or ideas, concepts, or information, with the possible addition of to the masses, because there was an important element of media that's mass communication. It's not really media. If you share it with one person, that's a whole other philosophical question that I don't want to go into. And there was an element of storing said information that I will come back to at a later point in time, and use that information to do this mind map, which was manufacturing as communication. And the things that are important on here, there's sort of 4 quadrants. So down here we have the anthropological, biological manufacturing as communication, which thinks about the information that we get about ourselves as a species based on the state of manufacturing techniques, the item itself, like what is getting produced and why we needed it. And like what all of those qualities of manufacturing, both the object, the process, and the maker, communicate to us about humanity. So metric to track migration, trade, population growth, GDP or worth, interaction with environment, especially the order of needs of resolving specific problems. So like which problems come up first, and do we consistently solve those problems with a similar thing? And then as an indication of the cerebral development of the species, like where the manufacturing is in its complexity and its information and its sort of like intellectuality of the problems it's solving, and relative to how we're developing as a species intellectually. I did go and define communication, but it was rather pedantic and not really a highlight. And here's some more sort of like concept of communicating truths about the needs of the populace or of the species, and the fact that products are used as to bridge distance, time, or language between people, places, or ideas or information. But the thing that I really took away from this is the concept of the technical image. I came back to it that we talked about with Jan last semester, and I couldn't stop thinking about product from manufacturing as a technical product. And I'll come back to that as well. And then that by defining manufacturing as communication, manufacturing is dynamic media. Like it's a one and the same kind of parallel, because of the parallel nature of forms of communication and the modicums and technologies that were required to produce it and support them. It's super parallel. And I just kind of break it down, development of language and writing led to all of these ways of communicating language. And then the need for transport as we expanded led to all of these ways of transportation. They're very specific versions and so on. And I kind of stopped there because I felt happy with where that was at. And I also explored manufacturing throughout the stages of human development. This was really important because it delineates both the way that manufacturing goes from simple to complex, but also how it's parallel to our development as individual humans. Starting with like interacting with our environment, mostly audiovisual, and like connecting concepts. We're not quite physical yet. We're connecting basic concepts to identify the environment. And then we connect physical concepts. And then we start exploring the socio-physical interaction of those concepts and how their relationships exist. And then we, as adults, enter like the manipulation of possibilities phase. So we know what those relationships are and we want to push them to their limit. And then we enter the ideation and creation of new versions of these, which parallels like academic evolution and evolution of specific fields and spaces of thought. And then once you get to like full intellectual maturity, which at this point, these stages, like we may have a new stage the longer that humans stay alive in a lifetime. But you're focused on idea creation of new combinations and systems of new ideas, or evolving previous ones into their sort of like next stage. So this was a pretty crucial intellectual progress. And this is where I was on Tuesday. Just want to bring these projects back to talk about how pleased I was with them, but that I kind of had a point of dissatisfaction. And Joe, you're the only one who I don't think has seen these in detail, but this was the senses project, which encouraged us to stimulate one or multiple of the human senses. And I ended up with this sort of constellation with lights box that people enjoyed putting their head in. And these were some of the constellations that I used. And then I used the same concept with a different image concept from a painting that I did in 2020 to create the Change My Perspective, where that like it teaches you the name of the constellation and then you lift up the paper and it's there on the sky. And I really just didn't feel like these projects were taking me in the right direction. They were fun, but there was something missing and I couldn't figure out what it was until today. So today I did what I feel like is becoming a topic, a pattern in my existence, which was called Joe panicking about what the heck I was going to say. And some of the advice that really resonated was to put my finger better on what I meant by manufacturing. Like, am I talking about the object, the technique, the people that are involved in the process, or the digital things that are involved in the process? I guess we're getting to that point. And to use an object as an example to delineate whatever it is that was. And since I didn't really feel like I understood what I was trying to say about manufacturing, I sat with that. And here are some epiphanies. I started by using Sabrina's questions that she provided for human data, and defined the project. I just started there, and I said, well, it has, 3 parts. I want to attempt to redefine the word and things that it encompasses, and redefine what it gets encompassed and what doesn't. And then I want to use that definition to find evidence of universality, which I feel like these first 2 I really took care of last semester in a big way, although I need to revisit them. And I came to this nice midpoint, which is manufacturing equals adult play. And then I was like, well, what do I mean by adult? I'm talking about, it moves to brain play as opposed to physical play, like when you're a kid, which is very intellectual. And we talk about intellect as an exploration of concept. So I kind of put all those words together. Then I came over here and thought about play for a little bit, because it bothered me that I used that word because I didn't feel like playing. What did I mean by that? So I put, interact with environment plus the use case of solving problems. That is how I'm defining play in this context, which is why it fits so well with exploration. And then I wanted to center the humane portion in the field. And then the place where I really took off was the concept of producing projects that are guided by the new definition with 2 goals in mind. And the first one was to show the technique's inherent evidence of this manufacturing, as I've defined it on the previous page. All of those words are here again, in all aspects of two categories, human labor and machine mechanic digital labor. And as I was breaking this down of like, what is the human labor portion of making a thing? And what is the machine mechanic making portion of making a thing? I realized manufacturing is a system to help solve complex problems. And this thing that I wrote really explains it well. Manufacturing is not about the skills of making or the technology or even the object. It's about the information it communicates about the state of our species and where it's at with its ability and scope of solving complex problems and projects. So it provides an infrastructure that is eternal, and that's why I keep referring to it like a fractal, or like an integral and a derivative in calculus, because it's like this eternal Russian doll of structures to solve problems. And so then I started thinking about what that says about where we are today. Like, if that's the definition of manufacturing as a concept, it's a structure to solve problems that requires us to interact with our environment. What does it say about where our species is at in its intellectual and cognitive development today? And I came to the conclusion that part of it is that it's inaccessible, so we can't really understand it. And it led me to the thought of empathy, because lack of accessibility, to me, like the foundation of lack of accessibility is not having empathy for someone and using that to take away their humanity. So I do think that the field is rife with lack of empathy at every level. And so to me, based on that logic and the understanding of manufacturing as a system of systems, essentially, I think the future of the field depends strongly on our ability in the field to permanently solve its issue of empathy. And if we solve it in manufacturing, it's one step towards solving it everywhere else. But manufacturing is so crucial and central to all of the systems in our society that it could make massive strides, if not completely solve our empathetic problems overall. Now, these are very theoretical. I have no idea how to apply them, but this is a start. And I do think that whether we succeed or not in this resolution of empathy decides whether we endure and move on to the next level in cognition, or we perish as a society. That was today's epiphany of the important, like where what I'm doing sits conceptually in its value to society. And then I started asking myself, I'm one person. What am I going to do about this? Like, where's my power stop? And so I did ask myself, what do I want? And I think that for me, I have only control over my actions, the actions that I influence, and the thought processes that I influence by existing and interacting with people. And so I want in those areas, in all the power that I can wield as one person, to begin the long, arduous process of fixing this empathy problem only in the manufacturing industry. Like, that's where I want my impact to be focused, so that we can, and others can fix it everywhere. And how I want to focus on how the solve will sorry, I cannot read my own writing. Anyway, we're going to ignore that word. And help to solve that problem in all areas with
impact, right?
Is that what it says? Thank you.
Maybe it looks like impact.
Yes, that's definitely what it says. Yes. How the solve will impact and help to solve the problem in all areas, with a focus on those that interface directly with manufacturing more immediately, question mark. I didn't want to give myself a scope. It's just like, this is the thesis of your life, like keep it in mind every time you do work. And I also explored what questions it was answering for me. What's the full impact and span of the field? What isn't manufacturing, and why? And these are important, but the big thing was before. So what happened to create or establish a definition of manufacturing that currently exists, and how does what occurred factor into the bigger problem, lack of empathy, and its solution? What are the impacts, positive, negative, of investing in the development or stunting the development of manufacturing habits in the human being at all stages of growth and development? These are things that I think solving or working this way will begin to be answered. And then, like, very shallowly, I think I'm going to use Art Nouveau style inspiration for the aesthetic of the book, because Jan mentioned it in class on Wednesday, and he did talk about the fact that there's this very repetitive sort of like quality of the themes in Art Nouveau that exist in previous versions that are highly inspired by many different art movements. I'm trying to find the one that he talks about ukiyo-e in Japan, and like it exists in all different places, and it continues to evolve. And so that felt very parallel to manufacturing. And so these are sort of the images that come up just on Google on Art Nouveau, and that's going to be the style that I use when I illustrate the book. And lastly, I think this is the perfect context, Joe, to use your advice, which is take an object and use it as an example. So I'm going to explain how the Lego in all aspects is a technical product, and that its technicality in the definition of Flusser is a microcosm of the process of manufacturing intellectually, developmentally, socially. And I have a plan. I already know how I'm going to do it, but I don't want to spoil it for everybody else. So that's one. And then I just put this here because I wanted to talk about other things that I was working on. We all know how the best way to dismantle the system is from the inside. So I have to become a really good designer. So I got to go get some street cred. And so I've been working on my woodworking stuff to start, and I'll be working through, all of the mediums slowly but surely. Can't wait to see what's next. Thank you for your time. I hope I spoke as quickly and as efficiently as possible, but there was a lot to get through. So
Thank you, Simona. You've had a very productive 8 hours since we spoke this morning. Well done. Okay, some thoughts for Simone?
I'm really impressed that you were able to tie in all the ideas that you've been talking about in the different classes and things, and in our conversations. The thing that stuck out to me is you had mentioned the idea that manufacturing is a way of communicating like through time, which is so aggressively my shit. I thought that was amazing and such an interesting idea, like creating something that people will use in the future, and also that same timeline of like this is a natural thing that develops in the human, like in human development. And those really stuck out to me as interesting points to continue with. Yeah, great.
It's a lot clearer to me now. I loved your mind maps. I really enjoy seeing your mind maps, but it's a lot clearer to me now the way you're speaking about it. And all of a sudden, you know, all these ideas are swimming around. I remember my dad used to work for Chrysler, and we used to get essentially a free car. And I literally went and picked up a new car off the factory floor. They drove it off the factory floor.
wow.
And all these people are around, and I drive off in this car. Not very well, in fact, because it was a stick and I didn't know what I was doing. So I would look like a complete idiot driving out of the factory. But it's kind of amazing. I'm even thinking to myself now, did that really happen? Did I really just
Yeah,
take something that was, you know, it was built that day?
that's
right?
wild.
But then I'm
Yeah,
thinking about Chris's study, and you know, for millennia, the vast majority of human history, manufacturing has been done off the backs of generally disenfranchised or slaves. Lots of them, lots of them. There wasn't any real need to create machineries or technologies because you had like tens of thousands of people from the country you just conquered last week
right.
come in and do stuff for you. So, you know, like, I'm really happy that you've brought that into your definition. It's very exciting. And I wonder though, you know, my feeling is that you can't not talk about the morality. You talked about, I
No,
can't remember.
and I will.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
the level of our intellect, but what's it done to our morality? I mean, we're all making compromises every day. I mean, there it is.
That's what I'm kind of
Yeah.
getting at with empathy. It's like it
Yeah.
allows me to talk about things like, you know, the current, like historically, the fact that so many disenfranchised people were involved in both helping and hurting that progress, right? And how we have become so unaware of that impact in that particular field, which now in today's world is one of the biggest levels of impact. It's not even like I talk all the time about material waste, but there's an even higher level, in my opinion, of just human life waste in that process. And that doesn't get talked about, or that is increasingly getting talked about, but that comes from that lack of empathy that I feel like, you know, we will not go anywhere forward. Everything will continue to fail if we do not solve our lack of empathy for our fellow human.
But we also have to look at the role of slavery in manufacturing too, though, Simone, and also the lack of empathy towards those who did all the manufacturing. Like, for instance, the U.S. Capitol, that was built by slaves.
Right.
Harvard University, built by slaves. Georgetown University, built by slaves. I mean, I think that's as much a part of the manufacturing issue as the stuff that you're dealing with as well, you know.
But that's exactly what I'm trying to talk about. Like, we don't have empathy. Like, we're working on it, obviously, as people who are aware of it, but we've lost our empathy for people who are different from us, for Black people, for brown people, for queer people, for gay people. And it's a systemic problem, which we all know. But I do think that the role, and this is something I'm also going to talk about, is the role of capitalism and how it's affected manufacturing since we've started using it as a system, which is like hundreds of years ago, and how it directly correlates to our lack of empathy for our fellow human being, and has allowed these atrocities of slavery as a system of production and capital gain. It's like we've been blinded by our own moral losses in the pursuit of financial gain. So it's definitely something I'm going to tackle.
Yeah, you can't not do that. You cannot not do that, you know. And this is the thing I found growing up in Detroit that shocked me is generation after generation after generation of families going into the automotive industry, despite massive layoffs every couple 2 or 3 years. And then the displacement of most of the jobs out of the Detroit area from the factories down to Mexico or down to Tennessee or now down in Alabama. But the families are still growing up going in there because the expectations are set then that that's the level at which that person deserves. Like they're not thinking beyond that level of that. So they quite literally become another cog in the machine. They happen to be the labor that's going to fill that position when their parents retire. Right. And that is a weird system.
And it's a direct parallel to slavery. Direct parallel to slavery, just without the psychological like weird.
Not slavery. Yeah, I mean, but yeah, you're absolutely right. So this is really exciting. It's nice to see these threads coming together for you so clearly. Really exciting.
Yeah, and I feel like if you hadn't told me, you know, just start with a Lego, just start with a product, I would not have gotten here, because it allowed me to sort of ignore all the noise and gather the information that I had.
Yeah,
about
Lego. I'm glad that helped, but you know, all that noise is incredibly valuable, you guys.
It's important, but when you're doing it all at once, it's a little bit like trying to solve racism, sexism, you know, homophobia, xenophobia, and like all of the isms like at the same time. You can't.
No, you can't.
So it was helpful. It was a helpful narrowing tactic.
That's great. That's great.
Chris, very you exciting. Put Jill Scott Heron. I thought you were going to mention who that was, or I don't know. You're on mute, Chris.
Yeah, Gil Scott Heron was a poet back in the 60s, and what Andrew had put up there earlier in terms of what was happening during the moon landing, Gil Scott Heron was the one who did that song originally back in like 1968, 69. And again, he was a poet. He was like one of the first spoken word rappers, basically, when you think about it. He really was. And also the Last Poets was another group of rappers / poets during the 1960s who talked about the issues of racism and discrimination and so on. That's who Gil Scott Heron is.
Okay, thank you. I will definitely look into him.
And one of his famous albums was "The Revolution Will Not Be Televised." It's actually a spoken word, like a spoken word video. It's beautiful. He's amazing. I know him as a musician. I think of him as a musician, not a poet, but I know he's both, right? So
exactly, he's definitely both.
Yeah, it's like a poem set to music.
Yeah,
it's pretty cool.
They sampled it for a different song that I know that I've like heard and done choreography to. So I'm excited to sort of use all of those things as inspiration. So thank you for that reference. I really, really, really appreciate it.
You're welcome. No problem.
Simone, have you ever read Player Piano? Do you know what that is?
Sorry, you got cut out. Have I ever read what?
Player Piano?
No.
It's by
Player?
Or Vonnegut. Yeah, Player Piano, like a piano that plays itself. It's about sort of like manufacturing in a way. It's like people have been displaced by technology in like factories and like manufacturing, and it's a lot of people discussing that, like they're being placed into like different castes because they're no longer needed or they're not smart enough. So since the robots have replaced them, and it sort of reminded me a little bit of some of the discussions that people were talking about.
That's something else that I decided not to mention, but that was very relevant to like connecting all of these concepts, is that some stray thought in this whole process of the day led me to ask my mom why she decided to become a doctor, because a couple things you should know about my mom. She's not from a wealthy family. She's from rural Tennessee, and she became a doctor in her late 30s, and with a child. And she went through community college and then did PT school and then did, technician stuff. And so she I asked her because I was curious. I was like, I don't really understand like what drew you to that. And one of the things that she explained was the one of the issues that delayed her realizing it for so long was that she didn't think she was smart enough. And it relates to like the way that the populations that are labor related in manufacturing, which her family was, it really impacts your thought process of like what's possible.
Yeah.
And that helped me also connect the dots for sure.
Yep. Very
Thank
cool.
you. I'll look into the movie for sure.
Great stuff, Simone. Thank you.
Thank you for your time, everybody.
Why don't we take a 10-minute break? Sound good? And we'll come back, and Andrew, you can pick it up, and then we'll finish with Chris tonight. Does that make sense? Okay, see you in 10.
Perfect. Thank you.
Great, thanks.
Okay. Um, and I'm just moving all the Zoom interface like I do every time. So, my mid-semester progress for this class. I started this semester, sort of where I left the last one, with these 3 projects that I really liked. Kind of my speculative human interface animation, and digital narrative, interactive game, and my Containers for Descent, which was like a sort of timeline type of project, also interactive. So that makes it dynamic. And so what I did, as you know, is I took those 3 ideas and I kind of used them as like starting points, and then mind mapped from there. So out of those 3 projects, I basically wrote down every idea I could come up with. And from that, I sort of started, I was like, there's kind of too much here. So I tried to like organize them into different categories beyond that. So, because I knew that like what I wanted to do was take those 3 projects and make them into like one thesis. And so these are just some lists of the what's and the how's. So like what I wanted to talk about and then how I wanted to talk about it. And one of the things that Joe told me was that like if you do both the like packaging and the content at the same time, then they might be more like in step with each other, or like might influence each other better. So jumping ahead a little bit, I did a bunch of research. These are, I just put them all here. Thought it might give a little bit of context. These are some projects, some of them I knew about and some of them I found out about. Some of them like the Apple Knowledge Navigator, that's like a conceptual video that was put out back in the 80s that sort of showed like a conversational interface where you could talk to your computer and it would talk back to you and it would bring up whatever you wanted and it could answer your phone. And it was sort of like a talking to a person in real life, which I really thought is interesting because it's sort of something that'll come up a bunch, which is like this idea of trying to create user interfaces that are more in tune with how people work and how we think. Building Utopia Deck. This is a super cool project. And this was sort of what I was referencing in my comments to Drew, which is this researcher and professor, or assistant professor, Christina Harrington, along with a bunch of other activists and artists, created this project. And what it is it's kind of like a starter kit with some prompts and cards and information about Afrofuturism. I'm really interested in futurism as a genre, sort of as a way of like, and there's like queer futurism and indigenous futurism, which is like sort of, it deals with, it's kind of like, I always describe it as like Black Panther, where it's like thinking about what if like these social issues, but in the future. And for a lot of people, like when you, especially in the times of like some of these examples that I'm showing here from the 60s and the 80s, when people thought about the future, they didn't think that there would be Black people in the future. They just imagined everybody was like a happy 1950s white couple, but they were like gay people in the future. Turns out we'll be there. And so I think that that's like futurism as a thing is really interesting. And what I like about the Building Utopia deck is that it's a way to, it's paper, paper could be dynamic, dash Martha, and you can use it to sort of educate people like students, learners, kids, whatever, about this idea that like there is a future and you can build it. I think that's really important and part of what I want my project to sort of inspire. Carousel of Progress, I like this because I've talked a little bit about it, but it goes from the past to the future, showing how, in that case, how electricity affected the American household. It gets updated all the time. Now the kids all have VR glasses. It's very strange. Now it's also at Disney World. HyperCard, which is a predecessor to the internet, like a little bit before. or the World Wide Web, I should say. And what it was is like you could use an easy to use interface to put your cards to make cards and share them with people, and it was a good way of sharing information. I'll kind of go quick, I guess, through some of these. Magic App, an operating system, but if you look at it, it looks very different than how I expect like my computer to work. Like it's literally a desk. So again, conceptual user interface is trying to think of like, what if the desktop was an actual desk and had like a phone on it and people could touch it? And these people, General Magic, they actually like envisioned like cell phones, like decades before, smartphones rather, decades before they happened. Project Xanadu, which is Ted Nelson, who talked a bunch about, who's in my video. The idea of intertwingularity as a way of representing complicated human knowledge and how it's nonlinear. So again, thinking of, in the case of Ted Nelson, is like thinking of how do you represent human knowledge in a digital form in a way that is more in line than a website. Like in the real world, I mean, I guess unless you like open the fridge and forget what you were there for, like your brain doesn't have broken links, but our computers do all the time. We have to like figure out what, just doing research, like some of these pages, I'm like looking up stuff from, you know, the 90s and the links are broken and it's like, well, they're going to be broken forever now because this web page is gone. Tablet newspaper, which you can imagine, except this was in the 94, it looks kind of like an iPad. How to read, they even had ads back then, funny enough. The book, The Best Interface is No Interface, which I considered as an art project, sort of because I think that what Golden Krishna, who works at Google now as sort of like a visionary type of person, is doing is what I was talking about with Anisha, like interfaces that are contextual and speculative. Like Joe mentioned, like there's this like bed that they can use in hospitals that has all these sensors and it can detect if you're going to like have like a heart attack with no beeping, no anything. It just will tell the doctors and the nurses, and they can come and help you. And by kind of tracking you 24/7 in this really helpful way, it is super important. And at the end of the book, he talks about like, well, everybody, in order to do all of this cool stuff, it has to like know you. So how do you do that in a way that is privacy and conscious and security focused? And that's something that I think is going to be more and more important as we go forward, is how do you create these experiences that need so much data without harming the people whose data you're collecting? Lastly is 2 was queer typography, which I've talked a bunch about in context of like zines. One of the things I like about this is that Paul Swellis, who works as a professor at RISD, one of the places, did this project where it's a printed zine, but it's also a website, and the website is like ever growing. Like if you try to scroll through it takes like 20 minutes now because it's just resources and resources and resources. And the presentation I think is really interesting, and the work he does with social issues. And then the last one is this really cool one called Life Streams, which is like a project at Yale, which again is like, how do you rethink the computer metaphor, the desktop metaphor, to the way people work? And so this would be, the way they describe it is it's like a record of everything you work on. It's like all your documents, all your projects, whatever. They even mention web pages, but they don't really give a lot of good examples for that. But how do you represent all that going back to what they call like your digital birth certificate? So imagine like, I don't know where that page went, or I don't know where that document went. It's like, well, it's in your live stream. I think that these kind of speculative or like conceptual user interfaces, a lot of times you might look at them and go like, well, what is the point of that? But these are some examples, and all of these are examples of kind of thinking about computing in a new way that is more human focused. And I think it's kind of the direction I want to go in my project, which is very like narrative, it's fictional, but it's like imagining. It's like imagining, I guess. So I put together this short description. I'm happy to throw this all away and to think of new words, but I sort of wanted to summarize what I think this project's about. I even gave it a code name, Far Out, which explores the society's intersectional relationship with computing through its history of outsiders, governments, and corporations, the future of ambient, biological, and exclusive experiences. It's a speculative project in service of technology that extends knowledge, empowers dissent, and respects humanity. And I'm happy to talk through what any of those keywords mean, but it's just sort of thinking about how has technology progressed. One thing I was thinking about today is you talk about like, well, the internet, it's like it matters what you everything is like insights. It's like, how many likes did you get? How much is your social profile worth? How much clout do you have? But the people who invented this, like I just mentioned 3 people who worked on like hypertext, they wanted to do connection. They were thinking about like it at a very human level. They weren't thinking of it as, how can I make you into a scrolling, clicking an ad machine? So any vision I think of the future would have to understand that past and then sort of pave the future with that. And I definitely think that's true of dissent. Like just the idea that in the future I would want to do anything that isn't tracked is kind of scary, especially when there's an actual war like going on right now. It's very well, I guess there's always wars, but a big televised one. So that's sort of that. And then I wasn't even going to include this, but I thought it might be good. I've been sort of taking that big idea and then turning it into projects. Everybody always says like, so what are you going to do with all of these fancy words? I have lots of thoughts. I think that this is always something I was like, I will come up with that, the what and the how. But something I'm still really interested in is the idea of interactive narratives, like making sort of, in the past was like the open world game. But that kind of thing where you can walk through, and I was even thinking in my review, I said I didn't get really good feedback, but I actually did get one that I really liked, which was, and a bunch of good resources, but the note that I got was that people were really drawn to the way that like a lot of my projects were like hand drawn, or some of the like user testing that I do. I had like paper prototyping and things, which I don't even really think about anymore. It's just like part of my process. I'm like a computer boy who starts everything with my notebook. And so creating kind of this interactive narrative that's like fully digital, like it lives on the computer, but is like completely hand-drawn, you know, is very human, and is talking about these sort of human issues of inclusivity and community, education, which is really, I think, kind of the end goal of all of these things, that human knowledge aspect, and then digital archivism. Another idea I had was this timelines of intertwingled events, which is a favorite word of all time now. And it's the idea that like you have kind of, I did my my like descent from the zine to the hashtag. And at that point, it's like a very linear timeline, but I started to be like, okay, but also this social media happened at the same time, because I believed that if you saw where social media was going and you looked at the way that these kind of grassroots groups were able to use technology, that there would be like parallels. This is like, what if this is like that, but like times 100? Is it the idea that multiple things are happening at once and you can kind of reference them? And I don't know if that brings us too much into the idea of like speculative, but I would like to work on a project at least where if I did look at a specific event, I could not just see it from like the x-axis, but also the y, and maybe if we're being cool, the z-axis, and understand it through time and how it influences, especially when you start to look at things like intersectionality, which is like made for this, like the idea that multiple points of view converge. I have this idea for an animation or a kid's book. I told you guys before, I did like to make books. I still do. But the idea of sort of, how do you deal with like privacy and attention? It's like a lot of my projects are speculative, and a lot of my projects are about education, because I think we need to like reach out to like younger people and people who are sort of coming at it from that angle. And so talking about these really serious issues of the attention economy, and I get all kinds of writing about that, but doing that in that way. And then the last one, which is a little bit vague, but is something I did a lot in my undergrad, but like the idea of digital zines, and then that's where I was thinking it might make sense, like the future of dissent. Like I've got a project about the history of computing, what's the future like, and finding new ways of using this platform that essentially, like I came out of it being like, there are no zines in the future, because the only way to have zines in the future is to completely reject technology and whatever. It's like, well, how I want to kind of work through that. And I think each of these projects could be one project, or they could be like dozens of projects. And so this is sort of my next step, I think, is continuing to like work on the big idea, but then also making sure that these like smaller ideas, or like these project ideas, also fit into that and expand and contract where it makes sense. And bringing in interactivity, because right now it's still very like in my brain. So allowing other people into is something I got as good feedback, I think. And that's it. So thank you.
Oh, that was fun. Down
I'm glad.
a walk down memory lane for me with all the great software and
Yeah.
systems that you showed. It was wonderful. Andrew, can you pull up the screen with the sort of statement on it, please? Because I misread it, and I misread it in a way that I thought was kind of interesting, actually. That I misread your last sentence, which reads appropriately, "It is a speculative project in service of technology." I read it as, "It is a speculative project in search of technology."
Ooh,
And I sort of liked the idea that I misread it.
I
I
like
think
that
it's
now.
just like, because
Write that
it
down.
speaks to this issue of one of the things that's been so exciting about the computer revolution is there have been so few models for us to build upon. That's why that screen with all the wonderful interfaces are also wildly different, and I remember seeing the Knowledge Navigator back in 1987. I was working at a consulting firm, and we were like special platinum Apple partners or something like that. I don't know. We got access to all sorts of stuff at the time and free computers. And I remember seeing it, and it blew my mind. And to this day, it's still one of the most, visually, it's really not held up very well. But in terms of solving a problem and working and collaborating with others, it's brilliant. It's still brilliant.
Right.
And so what I love about my misreading of this is it suggests that the activists, the individuals, the audience should be empowered to build something that works for them specifically. And what we're seeing so much of now is templated libraries of stuff. And I get it. I understand the capitalistic imperative for doing it. I understand the efficiencies. But man, I hate it when my undergrad students say they're just going to make another app, because you know what? It looks like 57 other apps I've seen before, and they're not thinking like this. And so I just really want to compliment you for stepping outside. And you're in a very unique position to do this because you are so much involved with that day-to-day templated sort of library. Am I right? So
painfully so.
yeah, it's super exciting to see you, going back to the roots of this time when everything was new. And I think it can be, but we've got to think about it differently. We can't, one of the lamentations of the early computer scientists was the fact that we started having big corporations that developed professional level software, and people didn't have to make software for themselves anymore. They didn't know how to do it, and that's why the real luminaries of the early computer age were people who were making their own games. Actually, Drew, that's good for you to know. That's how it grew. That's how the personal computer industry grew. People were building their own games, and they knew how to manipulate the stuff in the operating systems to create tools that worked for them.
Yeah, like Alice in Wonderland, right? It's like Alice is like first Mac game.
You got it.
Made by people. Yeah, I love that stuff. It's I describe it as like, because I was not alive in 1987. But I always think of like computers, to me it's like, oh, that's when it used to be fun, even like, and I think I like felt that way even in, I don't know, the early 2000s or whatever, and it's just like slowly become this like, it's just like scrolling. But no,
sorry, I don't mean to manipulate so much of the response time here. I want to hear from everybody else, but it's great stuff. Really exciting.
Before you close out, can you put it on the next slide just for like a minute or something while we talk?
Yeah, this is I'm not confident about slides, so be nice. No, I can't say I don't get enough constructive criticism and then tell people to be nice to me. Be honest.
Sure, you can. You can say anything you want.
Yeah, and I will.
I have a question for you.
Please.
How did you land on Intertwingled? Where does it come from?
Yes.
And will you even attempt to define it, or are we just going to accept that it's there and it's like quirky?
Yeah, so it's this project right here. I didn't know how much you guys have have heard me talk about this because I'm fairly obsessed with it right now. But it's the way this kind of image describes intertwingularity. So by the guy who came up with like the idea of hypertext too, which right now you think of it as like links and web pages. But the idea was that this one document in the middle here is pulling from multiple sources, and that these sources are still like kept together. So if,
Wow.
for example, the way they describe one of the good examples I've heard from Ted Nelson was the idea of like history of a place. Because if you read a biography, or you read like a whatever it's called, like a book about Germany, right? They're going to talk about like food and then entertainment and then music, but there's no way to see that all of those things were happening at the same time.
Yeah.
Like you can read them. Humans can only read linearly. I personally believe, and this is like an undercurrent of all my projects, and I know Jan kind of ingrained this in us, but like humans create tools to empower us, right? Like this is computers, technology should be a tool. And what Ted Nelson says is like the way that intertwingularity, this idea of kind of interconnected pieces of documents and information, is more in line with how like history and writing works. We just don't have like a good way of doing it right now. So the way of what I mean by intertwingled event is it was a little bit tongue in cheek, but to say events that happened at the same time, is there a way to kind of create so you can see them happening? This is like when I did that project in Jan's class with the life game, and it went like when it went over, you could tell that this guy like died when the digital camera came out or whatever. I thought it added a lot of context to that person's life. So
considering that, what limitations are you going to put on that concept? Because that's a big boy. Like, how are you? Do you have any thoughts on how you're going to interact with it?
Yeah, I mean, from a very basic level, because I have thought just in passing about this, is I think if I could see a sentence or a paragraph in a piece of text and click on it and then see the metadata of it, see where else it's referenced, stuff like that, I think that that would really allow us to kind of explore in a way that right now, if you've ever been in like one of those rabbit holes with Wikipedia, right? It's like you start looking up something and then next thing you know, you're like finding out about Hitler or whatever. Because it always goes back
My
to Hitler.
first project for Jan was just a Wikipedia hole. So I totally understand what you're talking.
Yeah. So like instead of going to that next page, this just like brings up more information. You could jump, but you can also just read more. Like, oh, I actually really want to know about food in Yugoslavia now. Or in this case, computing and dissent might be, you know, there's like this whole abolitionist angle that then, and it ends kind of, at least my original one did, like with the Black Lives Matter and everything. It's like there's a whole thread there that gets bisected by like feminism, and which also probably has, which definitely has a lot to do with that. So there's like all of that stuff is intertwingled. I can't think of a better word for it. It's like it works.
It's a great word.
It's so good.
Very excited to learn about intertwingularity.
I don't know if I'm fully using it right, but I love it. It's very interesting.
Not to be pedantic, but manufacturing is an example of a tool that allows you to view things like that. Anyway, sorry. I love it. Wonderful. Thank you.
I have a question that I'm a little confused because a lot maybe you don't know the answer to this question yet, but because everything you just talked about kind of sounded like an evolution in UI or a version of UI, but also like from projects you've done in the past, I know that you are also, and you just said you're interested in like education and informing. So is that like something that you're trying to do both, or do you have like a primary goal?
Yeah, I think that like, for me, I'm not like a programmer at a big company, right? Like what I do is I think about these ideas, and I think that like I do want to be a teacher. That's like what I've wanted to do since I was my first job. And then when I did teach, it was fun, but I wanted to do it in college and stuff. And so the idea that like, these are like concepts that are gonna like outlive me. So I think sort of thinking about like, how do you build, like in the way that in 1960, this guy came up with this idea and I'm talking about it today. That's like heady stuff. So for me, it's sort of like thinking about all of these ideas. How do you sort of create a blueprint for the future that can then go off and like actually influence the future. Like, don't just like, how do you create a better future as you like build it, right? So I think like for me, what this would be is it's a lot of like speculative stuff kind of focused at the human level, but for, you know, was it Sabrina's like rubric of like, who is this for? I was thinking it's like for students, I guess, or for like new designers. It's like, I joked in class it was for me, and they were like, oh, you have to be more specific. I was like, no, I mean literally for me. Like, I'm a college student who's interested in design. Like, that's what and the future of this, like, because like I think what Anisha does is so important and it's so interesting, but like when I think of the future that way, it's like that's like the near-term future. I guess I'm thinking more of like just like conceptual ideas or like metaphors, not necessarily like how am I actually gonna operate my machines in 20 years. And it's like it's a little bit more, and it's like out there, it's far out, man.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm very interested. It's hard for me to like comment right now, but I'm very interested to see what it comes to.
And I appreciate it. Thank you.
I think I resonate a lot with your work, and what I take away from this is that you're trying to kind of change the narrative of how people interact with the web, even with like the hyperlink and there being intertwining, I don't know if I'm getting the word right, between different links, and how usually we use like in a serial manner, you're kind of taking it and turning it into like a parallel way of interacting with the web. So yeah, I think it's, yeah, you know how much I appreciate your work. So
Likewise, for sure. Yeah, I think like when I was teaching, it was like the GED students, and so many of them use like translators and calculators and like all these apps, but the teachers would always be like, you can't have your phone out. And I would ask the other teachers, like, why can't they have their phones? Like, they're using them. Like, I can see them. And it was because, oh, they're going to be on Facebook or whatever. And I think that like, I don't, to me, it's computers aren't supposed to be, this is why I was like supposed to write a manifesto. Because like, to me, I don't think computers are meant to be these like machines that are just used to like capture our attention or just used for work, like for capitalism, for whatever. They should be these like things that allow us to create and to learn and to expand. And when I do think about like, and for dissent, like, I don't know, sometimes I'm like, I wish my computer project had a big social issue, but like I think it does. It's like this affects all of us. It like affects everybody, not just me. And that's like what I kind of want to show. And in my video for my midterm, I found this like silly YouTube video of like a kid with who's on the autism spectrum, and he like is using this like video app with his fingers, and he like touches it and it plays this like Incredibles, and this kid just like starts jumping and clapping, and that's like me as a kid. And I was like, this is what technology should be. It shouldn't be this thing where I like open it up and I go, oh, I got 900 more emails.
right.
That sucks.
Yeah,
there's so much opportunity. I actually care about it.
Yeah, we can tell, Andrew. It's wonderful.
Yeah.
I can't help but think that you could just, for fun, give yourself a few weeks and create some wildly speculative interfaces for fun. Just draw them out. I think you could have a blast with that. I really do.
Someday I'll send you my Figma.
Yeah. Or just the original Figma, your hand, right?
Exactly.
The other thing I wanted to mention is this idea of dissent. I heard something really that struck me as odd but completely understandable. Is that, we've seen how smartphones have been used in the last year, 5 to 10 years for communication tools in areas of conflict. We saw it during Arab Spring. We've seen it on Black Lives Matter, of course. Did you know that the Russian army has outlawed personal smartphone devices for all Russian military personnel?
I do believe I read that. And
so they've gone off to war without any of those devices. And so the government has essentially realized the value of those communication tools. And so they've been taken away. Their ability to document, to communicate, to share news with the rest of the world is simply just eliminated. So it's an interesting, harsh example of dissent or anti-dissent in this particular time period. I know that wasn't the main topic of what you were talking about this evening, but
No, it's a lot of it. It's like that thought of, you know, when Jan he posed the question of like, what does dissent look like in the future? And I'm like imagining like an episode of Black Mirror where people are running, you know, trying to get around a wall, and there's like eyes in the sky watching them. It's very like 1984. It's like very like everything that you grew up with. And I'm not trying to be like a, you know, a prepper or whatever, but it's scary. And I think that it highlights why these like kind of why computing is so important. Like when you have sort of a privacy focus, I like respect, because I think that's like it's kind of like quaint way of saying it. But it highlights how powerful those tools can be.
Yeah, I'm with you. I'll look forward to hearing more of your opinions about those matters.
Yeah.
Great stuff.
I think doing projects though is a good idea.
Yeah, just really wildly have fun, like push it really extreme, whatever, whatever. I think, yeah, I can't wait to see what you come up with. I'm really excited for what you're doing. It's great.
Thanks, everyone.
All right. Anything else? Thank you, Andrew. That was good fun. All right, Chris, the floor is yours, my friend.
Let's see. I'm going to share my screen real quick.
Great.
Can you guys see this?
Yeah, there it is.
Okay, good. Okay, cool. This is my this is just my annotated. This is a draft of my annotated outline for my final thesis proposal. And my thesis deals with from Reconstruction to COVID-19, how the medical profession makes Black people sick to racism and healthcare inequality, which started with slavery. Now, what I'm going to be doing with my project is I'm going to be dealing with 6 to 7 instances of the point I'm trying to make. And the point I'm trying to make basically deals with the fact of, let me just kind of roll this down, guys. I'm going to be dealing with 6 issues, and I'm not going to read this area here, but again, my thesis will deal with health disparities that African Americans have dealt with since Reconstruction up to the present time in dealing with COVID-19. So I'm going to start off with Reconstruction, 1865, the year slavery ended. And then I'm going to be dealing with experiments on Black women, the 1918 influenza epidemic, the Tuskegee experiments in the 1930s, homemade remedies of slaves who made, basically homemade remedies for slaves who got sick, had to get an abortion, so many different things that these elders made for home remedies, because they weren't allowed to obviously go to hospitals and everything was segregated back then. And then also I'm going to be dealing with a woman named Henrietta Lacks. Henrietta Lacks was a woman from Baltimore, Maryland, who was experimented on by researchers at Johns Hopkins University. And her cells were used for cancer research without her consent. And this goes back to my earlier point about how Black people were experimented on without their consent, especially enslaved Black people. And then I'm going to be dealing also with the AIDS crisis. And then I'm going to be ending on COVID-19. And the thing that I'm trying to get at in what my project is that I'm basically talking about how these 6 incidents, these 6 situations that happened, dealt with not only institutionalized racism, but also how we look at COVID-19 today. And then, for instance, how we look at, for instance, the 1918 influenza epidemic, in which hospitals were segregated and Black people were basically told to go home on their own. And the numbers, I'm basically making the comparison of how the whole idea of COVID-19, for instance, and for instance, more Black people dying from COVID-19 and more Black people getting COVID-19, going back to the issue of how those things were built into the system in terms of Reconstruction, the Tuskegee experiments, Henrietta Lacks, and basically talking about how the medical profession used the Black body to its for everybody else. And what I wanted to do was, I'm either going to do a I'm either going to do an exhibit, or what I would like to do is I would like to create some type of dynamic experience that talks about how Black people can basically get on this particular thing that I'm thinking about building and go back to, for instance, their ancestors and the diseases that they got on the plantation and afterwards, and to see how those diseases, for instance, are basically hereditary, and how our high rate of blood disease, heart disease, sickle cell, COVID-19, depression, obesity, how all these things played a role in Black people's health today, and how I want to kind of build, I'm thinking about building some type of dynamic experience that talks about how to create, the thing is, I really would like to build something that will be ready for the next epidemic. That's kind of like where my head is at. I really would like to build some type of dynamic experience that deals with better medical outcomes for the next epidemic that may come around, for all we know. And I would like to do something that goes along the lines of how a user, for instance, can look back at his medical history and his ancestors' medical history and see how he or she can be basically proactive with a specific act that deals with not only COVID-19, but also any other disease or any other epidemic, especially, that may happen in the near future. And that's kind of like where I kind of want to go with this project. And I obviously don't have the time, obviously, to read everything in there, but I really am going back to, for instance, when we talk about, and these are some of my resources here, you guys, references and resources, and it's a lot, like, for instance, ramifications of slavery persist in healthcare inequality today, or COVID-19 lays bare how racism fuels health disparities among Black people, or the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on African Americans. So I'm trying to like build case studies that talk about how the past repeats itself. How, for instance, during the 1918 COVID influenza epidemic, hospitals were segregated. So what Black doctors had to do was they had to basically build their own hospitals and basically build their own health organizations, because Black people were dying left and right through the 1918 influenza epidemic, and they weren't always given the vaccine. Like, for instance, today people having that fear of, for instance, the Tuskegee experiments and the 1980 influenza experiments, and that may explain people's hesitancy to not want to get the vaccine, especially among the Black community. And I also wanted to talk about how, for instance, the mortality rate among Black women, in which Black women die more in childbirth than any other groups of women due to racism in the medical profession, and also how Black women's wellness isn't taken as seriously as everyone else. So I'm kind of like going back and forth between, when I look at all these different articles that give me basically proof of, like, for instance, racism in care leads to health disparities, doctors and experts say, as they push for change. So it's not like it's not real. It's not like these things don't exist or did not exist, because they've always existed. But this has more to do with, I just wanted to show how some things in 100 plus years since 1918 have not necessarily changed for people of color when it comes to healthcare. So again, I want to build some type of dynamic experience that deals with fighting off what can happen down in the future, but also dealing with what's happening right now in terms of the health disparities, and how Black people could become more proactive when it comes to their health, when it comes to eating, when it comes to eating healthy foods, and so on and so forth. So that's kind of like where I want to go with this project, but I'm still kind of working on what exactly I want to do for a dynamic experience, for this specific project. And again, I've talked to Joe about how I really, I don't need to go back to before Reconstruction. I really want to deal with the parts of, for instance, Tuskegee and Henrietta Lacks experiments on Black women and how that plays a role in how Black people are treated or seen in hospitals where, for instance, the experiments on Black women were given to them without anesthesia because the mindset was that they could handle pain, which was obviously not true. And the guy named Marion Sims, he was a doctor who was called the father of modern gynecology at Johns Hopkins University, I believe. He was the guy, along with other scientists and doctors, who were giving Black women these painful experiments without anesthesia. And so looking at that today, when we look at how, for instance, people who've gone to the hospital with COVID are sent home. They're sent home without even being tested. And then when they come back to the hospital, they end up dying in the hospital when they should have been. If they had been taken care of the first time, they would have been fine, or at least it would have been more of an issue dealing with how do we make a better medical outcome for people coming into the hospital. So that's, I really want to do something that relates to those things, but also just tying them into how COVID-19 exposed the medical profession for all its warts in terms of, like, you know, more people, essential workers are getting COVID more than anybody. Black people don't always have time off to go into the hospital or to go into basically have sick time, so on and so forth. So I'm talking about not only the inequalities, but also how can I create something that creates a better medical outcome for the future? That's really where I want to go with this project, because it's like 6 issues, but there's so many more Henrietta Lacks. There are so many more Tuskegees that we don't even know about, you know, that we've never even heard of, you know. So that's really what I'm interested in. That's my real focus. I'm really trying to map down exactly what do I want to do for a medical, you know, for better medical outcomes. So I'm thinking about the family tree thing. I'm thinking about looking at medical records and so on, and you know, and also, like, for instance, Black people weren't allowed to go on the census until after 1865. So just think about that, those numbers of Black people that were undercounted when it came to sicknesses and so on, you know. So that's kind of like, that's really where I kind of want to go with this, but I'm still working on exactly what I want to do, whether it be an exhibit or I don't want to necessarily design an app, but I just want to design something that people could use in their hand that will trace or look at their family's history and their history and how hereditary, you know, how their diseases ended up being hereditary through slavery and after slavery. So that's kind of like where I'm at with this. So I'm still kind of working on it, you know.
Thank you, Chris. This is great. I think you've got such a really strong handle on the content of your project idea. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, thoughts for Chris?
I think I'm struggling to understand how the history of like their ancestors is gonna tie into what the solutions for them in the current scenario with COVID is gonna be. Because, like, me knowing the history, like, how will it help me in getting an admission into a hospital? Like, that's what I'm trying to kind of understand, like, how do you want to curate that experience, and like how will that information of the history play into how they are treated currently? So
well,
yeah.
I think that's kind of like what I'm working on, Anisha, in terms of, like, we can't necessarily change the attitudes of those who work in the medical profession, but we as human beings can change how they do their work, how they treat other people equally. You know what I'm saying? And I think that's kind of like where I'm going with this, where I want the user to take control of his or her health. I'm not creating an app that tells the medical profession, you guys did this and you guys did that. The app I'm trying to put together has more to do with putting a current user in the shoes of his past ancestors who didn't have the types of things, for instance, that we have today, and how we as patients can, and, you know, as human beings, can take control over how we get treated at a hospital, especially when it comes to COVID-19. But I'm still kind of working on what is going to be the goal, what's going to be the focus, you know.
Right. So this product is going to be directed towards the people at the hospital or towards Black people who come
It's
to
going to
get
be directed. It's going to be directed towards Black people in terms of them finding out how they can, you know, how they can get a better medical outcome, but at the same time, how do I change the attitudes of those who work in the medical industry? You know, I think that's kind of like where I'm thinking about, and like where I want to go with this. How do I change the attitudes of a 200+ year system that has always discriminated against Black folks when it comes to the hospitals, when it comes to all these different things, when it comes to the institutional racism that's built into the medical profession, you know? It's just like how, for instance, perfect example, how Black doctors are treated. You know, Black doctors, are they taken seriously as medical professionals? And at the same time, moving on from that, how do I get my user to take control of their health, you know, of their health situation? That's kind of like where I want to go with this, but I'm still kind of working on it, you know. Instead of, and, you know, in terms of having a primary focus, what is the user going to get out of this? Not me, but what is the user going to get out of this, you know?
Well, I think you just made a bunch of really good points that Anisha's question sort of prompted, and I think you should be writing those down. I hadn't really thought about it as this wonderful experience to help change attitudes within the medical community, but certainly it could be that way. I saw it as a way of informing people of just systemic repetitive patterns of racism and neglect, flat out neglect towards people that are considered not as worthy as the rest of us because you're Black,
Exactly.
right? So I think like all those are great. I think I really like the sections you've chosen. They're familiar to a lot of us, but most of us don't. Most white people I'm speaking of probably don't know the details. I think it's also possible that Black people might not realize the level of systemic racism living through the COVID era, for example, era. Excuse me. They might not realize it themselves, and so I think anything to illuminate this is certainly one deliverable that you can do with this system that's going to help make a difference. But all these other issues are super important as well, in the way that it translates to how people can take more control over their own healthcare now.
Exactly.
That's
really what I want. You know.
And there's no question. I'm not suggesting for a second that that white people suffer the same level of discrimination, but there is a weird, you know, the medical industry is sort of cloistered, right? It's sort of one where your doctor is at the very pinnacle of everything, not you as the individual. So in many ways, we're all sort of part of that paternalistic system, but clearly Black people and people of color are treated very differently than white people.
Joe, you're right. You know, Joe, when you talk about how doctors, for instance, treat women, how doctors, for instance, treat women doctors, as an example, white or Black, you know what I mean? How their opinion is never taken more seriously than a male. You know what I mean? So when we talk about those kinds of issues, when we talk about how women of all stripes get treated in the medical profession, where sexual harassment, okay, their opinions, if they're surgeons, they're not taken seriously. You know what I mean? And so I think that is as much a part of the whole structure of the medical profession being up here and everybody else is down here, whether they're, you know, female and so on, but that women their opinions aren't taken seriously more than men, for instance, especially doctors, you know. Yeah,
I mean, I think there's so much to uncover here. I think you've got, in my opinion, I definitely want to hear from everyone else. My feeling is your content is in a really good place. I know you've got a lot more work to do, but it's in a good place. It's probably a good time for you to start thinking about what's the best way to tell this story now.
Yeah, exactly.
Is it an exhibit? Is it an interactive exhibit? Is it a website? I agree, it's probably not an app. probably not
definitely
even
not
that.
Not at
But
all.
you know, maybe it's an interactive video, maybe it's a web series of documentaries or interactive documentaries. I don't know, but I think
Mhm.
that's what you want to start to think about. And really, you know, between now and the end of the semester, you've got quite a bit of time to really indulge in like what's the best way to share this with the world.
Exactly. Exactly.
I can't help but feel too that if you look at museums of Black culture, Black art, Black design, I can't help but think that they'd be interested in something like this. Like, are there museums of medical history? I'm sure there are.
Yeah,
Or
exactly.
museums of natural history, even like start to think about like where this should be, how it should exist.
Exactly.
It's just a lot of it's a brain dump there, but
Definitely. And that's why I say, Joe, I'm still kind of like, I don't necessarily want to design an app, but I also want to design a tool for users to use to find ways to create better medical outcomes so they can take control of
yeah,
you know what I mean, of their health. So I want to tie in 1918 Reconstruction to COVID-19 and the disparities that have happened, because COVID-19, when we heard about COVID-19, like that many people are dying, really? You know, seriously? But that many more people are dying. So that's why it wasn't as much of an issue with those people dying in terms of the urgency, you know.
Yep. Yeah, it's the same old, same old. I mean,
Yeah,
nothing
that's
new
what
here,
exactly.
really.
Exactly.
It's a shame. But I mean, think about the way Drew is imagining how to talk about the difficult issue of race and inequality through the platform and the experience of a video game, where I'm going to be able to discover for myself as the user, you know, a lot of these things that he's planned and develop empathy for this poor man who's been sent off to space, presumably for something he didn't actually do. Right. So like he's got this platform, if you will. I don't know, Drew, help me out here with the words, but he's got the narrative structure for an experience that can be really transformational. And I think you need a similar structure like that. And it's a good time to start thinking about it because you've gone so far with the content. I mean, that's the beautiful part here is that you've got the content handle. But Drew, I'm interested to hear just from your perspective as a storyteller, right?
Yeah, I think that you nailed it, Joe. And I think that Chris, because this content is so good, I think all you need to worry about now is like pitting it to making sure as many people see it as possible, because it's not even like you have to like go for the medical field. I think the power is in the people. Like those are the people who are going to end up making the change is when the more people know about it, you know? So just ways of engaging with people. It could be a board game. It could be like an online exhibit, anything that makes it digestible.
Exactly. Exactly. Definitely. Thank you, Drew. You're right. Because I haven't really thought about it yet, but I definitely don't want to necessarily design an app, but I also want to design an experience. That's what I really would like to do. Yeah.
It's good stuff, man.
Thanks, you guys. Appreciate it.
Any thoughts, Andrew or Simone?
I did like the ideas of like a in-person sort of gallery exhibition type of thing. I grew up in New Bedford, where there's like an abolitionist museum and stuff. It's really interesting. No, I mean, I agree with everybody. I think the ideas you have are really interesting. What Joe put in the chat about the next like epidemic is a big deal.
Exactly. Exactly. And that's kind of like what I'm pushing for, Andrew, is like, how do I prepare people for the next epidemic? You know what I mean? How do I prepare people for the next COVID-19 epidemic? You know what I mean? In the future, next week, next year, you know what I mean? So that's kind of like what I'm trying to do, you know, in that sense.
Yeah, it's very like practical in that way. And I think that that's like, compared to some of the like, I have very like conceptual ideas, but this is such like this will actually like, could like literally help people stay alive. I think that's, I really like that.
I've lost a few. I've lost. I've had family members get coronavirus, but luckily I haven't lost anybody. you know, but still,
Yeah.
when a family member gets it, that hits home. You know what I mean? And I think for me, on a personal level, it's not like my cousin, my other cousin, this other person, my sister, you know, people got it. You know, so I think so that's why it hits home for me on a personal level, because I'm saying to myself, and thank goodness they weren't like sick, you know, or anything like that. You know what I mean? They got it and they got well. They went to the hospital, and I'm glad for that. But it got me to thinking, what can we do? What can I do? You know, and especially in this case right now, it's like I'm saying to myself, what kind of medical outcome can I create that's a positive one? You know.
Well, so I'm pretty intimately familiar with the process of medical school since, as I mentioned earlier, my mom's become a doctor. And I was just thinking a very interesting format that this could take could be like a workbook that's kind of made for medical students. Like, I think that's a really good way of communicating that information. And it gives you the opportunity to work with a lot of sort of anatomical imagery, but also geographic imagery, because I know that like a lot of medical students are visual spatial, so they're visual learners and they're tactile learners, so they really relate to like moving things around. So like a workbook is a really flexible space, right? You could build book with all the
like
concepts.
an empathy workbook. You know what I mean? Like an empathy workbook.
Right, exactly. And like it gives you opportunities to like design, because paper is such a versatile material. It gives you opportunities to design like pages where people can like rip the page out and there's like a perforated shape that if you fold it in the right place, it makes a shape that like helps you communicate your idea, or like you know, depending on what part of your story you're at, right? Like paper is such a versatile thing. Like maybe you can, like, it gives you a lot of dimensionality. For example, I don't know if you remember the book that Martha brought to studio where she had the piece of paper with perforations.
Yeah, I remember. Exactly.
You could do something like that where you have like a paper Black person and you're trying to communicate the like, you know, there's this evidence of the history of slavery and like their reality, and you could communicate that using like perforations of images that like they use their phone to like see, and so you can connect like this image of this experience in slavery physically to that Black person that is depicted in that paper. So I feel like a workbook for medical students is a really great way for you to communicate all this information to the right people.
It really is. That's a great, no, because you got me thinking now about when you said workbook, the first thing that came to my mind was an empathy workbook, because we've been talking about that, you know, throughout the whole class. We've been talking about the whole, what empathy means and what it does. You know what I mean? So putting together something like that, where an empathy workbook that talks about what can you do to reach out to someone who is sick that's different from you.
Exactly.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, definitely. And like, you know, it like the other thing that just popped up in my head when you're talking about an empathy workbook is having like an exercise in the workbook where there's like an iPhone screen and there's these like options of like how to reply to a text message that like sort of teaches ethics and empathy, right? And so you can pick the right text message answer and like put it, I don't know, like making it fun for them and also teaching.
I know exactly what you I know exactly.
Yeah. So that would be, I feel like that's a great format for you. And I'm excited to see
the idea of the empathy workbook is what I really like. That's why when the minute you said empathy, the minute you said workbook, it's an empathy workbook. Because that's all we've been talking about that the whole time.
Exactly.
You know what I mean? So, I like this idea. I really do.
This is the power of a seminar class. We get these wonderful ideas with each other.
Thank you. That's a great idea. It is, because remember when she brought it in and she folded this thing out, and then she had another one too. I remember.
Yep.
And you know, and it was really cool, really nice.
It was pretty wild, Joe. I don't know if you're familiar with this book.
Please mention it to me. What's the name of the book?
You should borrow it or like have her show it to you. It's a children's book that uses paper folding and like structurizing and cutouts and light to like extend the metaphor. So like the one that she showed us was like like a
Planetarium.
jungle scene, I think.
Okay.
And then yeah, because it like the context was like my constellation thing, which was also a light reflection cutout thing. So she like put her phone in it, and you had like a jungle scene on the wall, and it like added this extra dimension to the story in the book and to the point that the book was making. So
Cool. I'll
I
ask
feel
her
like
about it.
medical students' lives are so boring that this is such a fun way of like, I don't know, spicing it up. So I can't wait to see what you do with it.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Yeah, it's really exciting. All right. Wow. Again, I have to say I'm thrilled with where you're all at. Such rich projects, great research to date. Like, it's really exciting to see where you're all heading off. Do you feel good about where you're at this point in the semester? You all seem excited and passionate about your ideas. I love it. It's very exciting for a professor to be around a group of people that are this enthusiastic and care so much and so knowledgeable already about what they're doing. I'm really grateful to be working with you. It's very exciting. Really exciting. All right, so next week I think we're back to individual meetings, if that's okay. I'll send you out a sign-up sheet. Yeah, any questions, concerns, comments about anything?
If we're turning in assignment 3 late and we just put it in our folder, how will you know? I always wonder that. How will you know that we put it there? Or should we notify you that we did?
Just send me a quick email. See, that's
Okay.
something that Drew's interface would tell me that it's there, right? But it doesn't. It should. Don't worry about it. I'm more concerned, and I want to be clear. I'm thrilled with where everybody is, and these deadlines are there just to help us kind of keep on track. But I don't want them to be the tail that wags the dogs, right? Yeah, sorry, Anisha's interface too. Okay. All right, guys. Anisha, I hope you feel a little better. Hope you feel a lot better, frankly. I
Please
hope you
get
feel a lot better. Yeah, take good care of yourself. Okay. Good night, everyone. Thank you.
Nice.
Good night. Thanks,
Bye.
everybody.
Later, you guys.
Joe, where will we find the recording? I do want to see it.
Yeah, I'll upload it tomorrow. It usually takes an hour or two to get downloaded.
Okay.
But,
Yeah, and then a follow-up question about the schedule.